Back to Iran now, where we're being tapped as a recruiting director for a club of 50,000 suicide bombers who are willing to blow themselves up to advance their religion of peace may at first seem to be a daunting task. But evidence tonight that those pesky liberals who claimed the Iraq war was a recruiting tool for al-Qaeda, well, they may just have had a point. The LA Times is reporting this weekend of a playboy terrorist who spent the past 4 years living large in Hollywood's club scene. The good-looking Jordanian had a taste for sex, drugs, the rock group Nirvana, and Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Those secular tastes may explain why his L.A. entourage is more than a little confused as to why their friend's severed hand ended up 8,000 miles from Whiskey A Go-Go attached to the steering wheel of a car bomb that killed 155 Iraqis. The young man's parents are also at a loss as to why their son switched from bar hopper to Baghdad bomber, especially after professing hatred for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda following the September 11th attacks. Question tonight is whether the Playboy bomber is proof that Iran can find waves of angry young men who are willing to launch terror blitzkrieg against New York, Washington, Seattle, L.A., and possibly your hometown. With me now to talk about it, NBC terror analyst Roger Cressy, also with us, MSNBC political analyst Monica Crowley. We also have Charles Kupchan. He's a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. And Roger, let me begin with you tonight and ask, is it possible that Iran could launch waves of terrorists against U.S. and British targets?
Well, I think it's possible they could launch waves of terrorists, Joe, but they have a global capability driven in large part by two of their principal organizations, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Al-Quds Force. They also have in their patrons Hezbollah, the best terrorist organization in the world, next to Al-Qaeda. They certainly have the capability to launch attacks inside the United States as well. So it's a global capability, and we should not take it lightly.
You know, your former boss, former White House counter-terror chief Richard Clarke, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday, and he said this, quote, Iran could use its terrorist network to strike American targets around the world, including inside the United States. Iran has forces at its command that are far superior to anything al-Qaeda was ever able to field. Does that mean, Roger, that a possible military strike against Iran to stop this nuclear device from being created is off the table?
No, it doesn't. But, Joe, if I was still at the White House, I'd be telling the president and his advisors right now, any military strike against Iran right now would virtually guarantee a response by the Iranians toward us in the form of terrorism. They would use an asymmetric means to respond, and their greatest capability is through terrorism. So you have to factor that into the planning. Absolutely.
Monica Crowley, the National Science Foundation, drew up a scenario in which a 150-kiloton bomb constructed by terrorists was detonated in New York City, in the heart of Manhattan at the foot of the Empire State Building. Now, 1 second after detonation, 75,000 people would be killed instantly, and nothing inside the blast radius you see there would be recognizable. After 4 seconds, the shock waves extend 1 mile from ground zero, killing an additional 300,000 people. Commuters using New York City subways would be trapped underground, possibly for days. After 16 seconds, the shock waves extend 4 miles around, causing permanent blindness and thousands of victims, with the final tally, 830,000 killed, another 875,000 injured. Monica, is there any possibility that the Iranian leaders that are in charge right now would ever be so irrational as to launch a nuclear attack on cities like Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C., if they got this nuclear device?
Unequivocally, yes, Joe. And in fact, the hypothetical scenario that you just laid out, that hypothetical ground zero is just a few blocks from where I'm sitting here tonight. So it is an incredibly frightening scenario and absolutely within the realm of possibility, given the nature of the regime we're talking about. This Tehran regime covers the terrorist trifecta. They do have weapons of mass destruction, possibly even nuclear at this point. They export terror, and they do support al-Qaeda.
Okay, but Monica, let me ask you this. I want to show a picture of where you are. Let's go ahead and go to the live shot in New York right now. Monica, if Tehran were to launch attack, and we have a shot up of Times Square right now, if they were to launch an attack in Times Square, they would have to know that we would go in and obliterate Tehran and their entire country. I mean, of course, during the Cold War, we called it mutually assured destruction.
Right.
They have to be logical enough to understand their country would never survive a nuclear attack against us.
But, Joe, you're dealing with a regime that is not logical, and it is also not rational. The president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, really believes in bringing on a Muslim-led apocalypse. This is what he genuinely believes. You only have to go and look at the statements he makes pretty much on a daily basis. Look, the Tehran regime has missiles with which to deliver the weapons we're talking about. They're intermediate range, meaning they can reach Israel. They cannot yet reach the United States. But that doesn't mean that Tehran's based weapons, and again, we may be talking about nuclear weapons that they may already have, they would pass them off to al-Qaeda and allow al-Qaeda then to bring them into the United States and detonate them. There's no reason to suggest that the maniacs in Tehran would not give those weapons to al-Qaeda and allow al-Qaeda to go and do its dirty work for them.
Charles, I want to show you a poll that was taken, a recent poll taken by the LA Times and Bloomberg. The question asked was this: would you support the United States taking military action against Iran? 48% said yes, while 40% said they would oppose it. And I got to tell you, Charles, I'm actually surprised by those numbers 3 years into a bloody war in Iraq. But what does that tell you about Americans' attitude towards Tehran, towards this regime that has really haunted us since the 1979 Islamic revolutionary takeover?
Well, I think in the American public imagination, Iran is at least enemy number 1, 2, or 3, but certainly at the top of the list because of the revolution, the seizure of the embassy, the holding of hostages. And Iran is well known to have sponsored terrorism against targets throughout the Middle East, particularly in Israel. So we know that there's a bad track record there. And I think the fact that it's 48 to 40 suggests that Americans are well aware of a couple downsides to attacking Iran. Nobody wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but this would not be a cakewalk, in part because we're not sure exactly where all the nuclear installations are, and in part because there would be some sort of likely retaliation for an American strike. We've been talking about the prospect of terrorist attacks in this country or elsewhere, but there are other ways that Iran can get back at the United States. Two come immediately to mind. One is in Iraq. Iran has a lot of leverage in Iraq. They can make our life even more difficult than it already is. And second, oil. Iran is the 4th largest producer of oil in the world. They sit aside the Strait of Hormuz, where 40% of the tankers in the world go through to get oil to the international marketplace. If there is trouble, they can close off the strait or try to. They could decrease production. They could make oil prices jump above $100 per barrel overnight. This doesn't mean that
it looks like it's going that. Yeah, it looks like it's going that way right now, Roger. Even without that additional situation coming from Iran, Roger, I want to ask you about these scenarios. Of course, we're talking about with this scenario that we just showed a nuclear blast, but talk about the possibility of a dirty bomb being detonated, which of course is much easier to detonate, whether it's at the Time Warner building or whether it's the Empire State Building. What is the economic impact of that type of nuclear blast if we try to do to Iran what Israel did to Iraq in 1981 and scramble jet fighters to go in and blow up nuclear installations?
Well, the shorter answer is we can't. We do not have the ability to get the same degree of success like the Israelis did in '81 in destroying the Osirak nuclear power plant today.
Without putting boots on the ground in Tehran.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but it would require a sustained military campaign, Joe, of naval and air assets that would strike literally hundreds of targets. So there's no such thing as a surgical strike in this scenario. Now, in terms of a dirty bomb, a radiological dispersal device, that's not a weapon that would lead to a lot of immediate casualties. It's much more a weapon of fear, of panic, and economic consequence. Because any target that is hit with an RDD, it will be contaminated for years and potentially decades to come, depending on the radioactive material
let's
used.
talk about some of the cities we've shown. We've been showing Seattle tonight. We've been showing Los Angeles. We've been showing New York. Talk about the impact of one of these dirty bombs whether it's in New York, Chicago, L.A., or Seattle?
Well, if it's detonated in a major metropolitan area, the several square miles around that immediate point of detonation will be uninhabitable for decades to come. Again, depending on the type of radioactive material you use. You're not going to have a lot of immediate deaths, but the size of the cloud that is released from this bomb will obviously lead to radioactive poisoning for people caught in the path, and there'll be long-term cancer risk and certainly death that way. But, Joe, when you compare it to a traditional nuclear weapon is truly a weapon of mass destruction, and RDD is much more of an economic weapon, I would argue, than a typical WMD.
Monica, wrap it up for us. Do you believe that we're going to be able to resolve this crisis with Iran diplomatically?
I'm not very positive on that, Joe. I really don't see it happening at the United Nations because we're going to have a similar situation in the Security Council over Iran that we had on Iraq. Remember, the French were deeply involved with Saddam Hussein, and they blocked us at every turn. In this case, we have the Russians and the Chinese, who are also deeply involved with the Iranians, very lucrative contracts, delivering a lot of the nuclear material and information and know-how that we've been talking about. Most important point here is do not believe for 1 second that the Iranians say that they're going to wait for an American provocation to unleash this kind of activity. They don't need an American provocation. This is part of their state policy. They will act regardless of whether we act preemptively or not.
All right. Thank you so much, Roger Cressy, Monica Crowley, and Charles Kupchan.